Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a mountain of information and distill it into those crucial nuggets you need to be truly well-informed. Today, we're embarking on a fascinating journey back to ancient China, specifically the tumultuous era leading up to its very first unified empire.
Yeah, we're going to unpack the story of Qin Shi Huang, the man often called China's first emperor. It's a story of, well, incredible ambition, ruthless pragmatism, and unprecedented change, but also, surprising fragility.
Our mission for you today is to understand not just how he unified China, but the deep historical forces and their frankly brutal system that made it possible. And crucially, how the very pillars of their strength might have also contained the seeds of their surprisingly swift downfall. We'll explore the Warring States period, the revolutionary reforms in Qin, the emperor's own rise, the military campaigns, and then that complex legacy he left behind. Okay, let's unpack this. So imagine a China that isn't one nation, but a battleground. 7 fiercely independent states locked in, over 2 centuries of total war. This was the Warring States period. So what was it about the state of Qin, once considered sort of a semi-barbarian backwater by its rivals in the east? How did it manage to conquer everyone?
Well, what's fascinating here is that Qin's success wasn't an overnight thing. Not at all. It was really the violent outcome of a century-long root and branch reform process, and it was driven by this philosophy called legalism.
Legalism.
Yeah, an authoritarian ideology, basically. Believed human nature was inherently selfish, so you needed strict laws, harsh punishments, all to maintain order and build a strong state.
And right at the heart of this transformation was a figure named Shang Yang. He sounds like a real architect of state power.
Yeah.
What did his legalist revolution actually entail?
Shang Yang implemented these really radical social engineering programs, and they were aimed squarely at one goal: Fugo Qingbing.
Which means?
Rich state, strong military. That was it. He literally rewired Qin society for war.
How did he manage that?
Okay, well, he started by reorganizing households, grouped them into these tight units, 5 or 10 households together, and they operated under a system of joint responsibility.
Joint responsibility.
Yeah. If one person committed a crime and the others in the group didn't report it, the whole group faced brutal punishment, often dismemberment at the waist.
Wow.
It effectively turned the entire populace into an apparatus of state surveillance, total compliance through fear.
And how did he mobilize the economy?
Economically, everything, and I mean everything, was geared towards production and military strength. There were clear rewards if you exceeded your quotas in farming or textiles, like exemptions from labor. But if you were deemed idle, you could actually be sold into slavery. And get this, to incentivize more farms, more production units, any household with multiple adult sons who hadn't split off to start their own farms faced double taxation.
That's a powerful incentive indeed. But maybe the most impactful reform was the military one.
Oh, absolutely. Shang Yang completely abolished hereditary positions in the army. No more nobles getting top jobs just because of their family. Status, honor, land, it was granted only based on military merit.
And how was merit measured?
Specifically by the number of enemy heads collected in battle.
Seriously, heads?
Yes, heads, private feuds, settling personal scores. Severely punished. This created an incredibly aggressive, highly motivated army where war was the only real path for social advancement for commoners. Your entire future depended on how many enemies you killed.
That kind of system, imposing that must have been incredibly difficult. How did he get people to actually trust these new, terrifyingly strict laws?
Right. Well, he conducted this brilliant psychological experiment. He put a big wooden pole at one of the city gates and announced a huge gold reward to anyone who could just move it to the north gate.
Just move a pole?
Yeah. People were skeptical, obviously. Seemed too good to be true. But then one man tried it, moved the pole, and Shang Yang gave him the massive reward, right there and then. The news spread like wildfire. It wasn't about the pole, you see.
It was about proving the state meant business.
Exactly. It established beyond any doubt that the new laws would be strictly and reliably enforced no matter how unbelievable they seemed. Build trust in the system, even a brutal one.
That's fascinating, like an ancient PR campaign for authoritarianism. And the ultimate proof of its effectiveness is that even after Shang Yang himself met a pretty gruesome end.
Oh yeah, torn apart by 5 chariots after his patron Duke Shao died.
Even after that, his system remained. It was just too effective for the new ruler to get rid of. It showed the law was supreme, even above its creator, ensured that institutional continuity.
That's a really crucial point, because it shows the long game Qin was playing. If you connect this to the bigger picture, Qin's success wasn't just about having a strong army. It wasn't luck. It was about creating a political and social system specifically designed to generate and sustain that army indefinitely. While other states were still clinging to, old feudal ways, Qin's entire bureaucracy, its economy, its social structure, they all became subsystems of this war machine, this systemic advantage built up over a century. That's why they ultimately conquered everyone. Qin wasn't just a state with an army. In a way, Qin was the army.
And that level of control, while revolutionary, also built a system with no safety valves, right? No room for error.
Precisely. And that's a critical point we'll come back to when we talk about why it all fell apart so quickly.
Okay, besides the system, geography played a part too, didn't it?
Absolutely. Qin was based in the Wei River Valley, very fertile land, and crucially, it was protected by the Hanggu Pass to the east. Great for defense, but also a perfect choke point to launch attacks from. Its position on the edge, the periphery, also let it expand west and south into non-Chinese tribal lands, places like Shu and Ba. So they could grab resources and manpower without immediately clashing with the stronger eastern states. It gave them a secure base and room to grow first.
So you have this incredibly efficient, militarized state in Qin. How did the other states, the rivals, actually stack up against this machine?
Well, their weaknesses become pretty clear in comparison. Take Chu, for example. Huge territory, lots of resources, but it was very decentralized. They had real problems with supply lines over that vast area, made them vulnerable.
Okay, what about Qi?
Qi was wealthy, incredibly rich from salt and iron monopolies, but maybe a bit complacent. Their military wasn't as well organized or as driven as Qin's.
And Zhao. They seemed like a serious contender for a while.
Zhao was innovative, especially with cavalry tactics. They gave Qin some tough fights, but they suffered this absolutely critical, devastating defeat at Chengping back in 260 BCE, lost a huge part of their army. Plus, their court became weak, easily manipulated, as we'll see.
And Han and Wei.
Smaller, more exposed, basically caught between bigger powers. They were playing checkers, as you said, while Qin was playing this brutal, long-term game of chess.
Okay, so with this formidable state mechanism honed over a century, who was the man who finally took the reins and, well, executed this grand conquest? Let's talk about Ying Zheng, the man who would become Qin Shi Huang. His early life wasn't exactly straightforward.
No, definitely not. Born around 260 BCE, he actually spent his youth as a hostage in the enemy state of Zhao. And there were always these rumors, probably later propaganda, but rumors nonetheless, that he wasn't the true son of the Qin king, but the illegitimate son of this powerful merchant-turned-chancellor, Lu Bue.
Adds a layer of drama, certainly. He becomes king of Qin at just 13, right? With Lu Bue as his regent. But getting full control wasn't easy. What challenges did he face inside his own court?
Oh, he had major challenges. He basically had to consolidate his power through a series of, well, pretty brutal purges. First, there was the whole Laowai affair.
Ah, yes, the fake eunuch.
Exactly. He became the lover of Ying Zheng's mother, the Queen Dowager Zhao Ji, and they even had 2 secret sons together. It was a huge scandal waiting to explode.
And it did explode, right? When Ying Zheng was about to take full power.
Precisely. When Ying Zheng turned 22, the year he was supposed to assume full control, Lao Ai panicked and launched this desperate rebellion. But Ying Zheng acted decisively. Ruthlessly, the rebellion was crushed. Lao Ai was torn apart by chariots, that favorite Qin punishment again. His whole clan was exterminated. And his 2 young sons with the Queen Dowager killed. Ying Zheng even put his own mother under house arrest.
Oof. And this scandal also gave him the opening to deal with Lu Bue, his regent, maybe his biological father.
Yes. Ying Zheng used the fallout from the Lao Ai affair to remove Lu Bue, who was arguably the most powerful man in the kingdom besides the king himself. Lu Bue was dismissed from all his posts, exiled. And fearing an even worse fate down the line, Lu Bue eventually committed suicide.
So this internal struggle, it wasn't just a distraction, it was formative for him.
Absolutely formative. Taking down powerful figures like Lao Ai and Lu Bue that taught Ying Zheng the brutal realities of court politics. It honed his planning skills, his ruthlessness, and it tested the loyalty of the entire state apparatus he inherited. He couldn't conquer 6 external states if he couldn't even control his own court, his own mother, his own chancellor. This internal consolidation was essential. It perfected Qin's focus.
Right. And with absolute power finally secured around 238 BCE, his vision just explodes, doesn't it? He's no longer content to be just a Bawang, a sort of first among equals, a hegemon. Influenced by his legalist advisor, Li Si, he sets this totally unprecedented goal. conquer all the other states, create a single unified empire under one ruler, seen as, what was the phrase, an opportunity in 10,000 generations to end the warfare through total dominance.
And it wasn't just his vision. The success really came from a kind of synergistic leadership. You had Ying Zheng with the ambition, the drive, the ultimate authority. You had Li Si, the brilliant legalist strategist, providing the intellectual framework, the detailed plans for conquest and for running the empire afterwards. And then you had incredible generals like Wang Jian, who were masters of executing those plans on the battlefield. It was a real team effort, albeit a ruthless one.
Okay, so the goal is set, the machine is perfectly tuned after that internal struggle. The stage is set for this incredible decade of warfare that literally reshapes China. What was the core strategy guiding these campaigns?
The key was this strategy called Yunjiao.
Meaning?
Befriend distant states, attack nearby ones. It was brilliant diplomacy, really. It stopped the other states from ganging up on Qin in one big alliance, which was their biggest fear. So Qin would sort of neutralize or placate distant rivals like Yan and Shi, maybe using diplomacy or bribes, while focusing its full military might on the weaker, closer targets, pick them off one by one.
And it wasn't just brute force military campaigns, was it? There was a lot of cunning involved.
Oh, absolutely. Qin employed a whole range of tactics beyond the battlefield. They used spies extensively. Assassins were definitely part of the toolkit. Bribery of influential court officials in enemy states to sow discord. Basically creating internal chaos to weaken states before the Qin armies even arrived. It was a total package: psychological warfare, espionage, and military might combined.
Let's trace the fall then. It happened incredibly fast, really just a decade. First was Han in 230 BCE. Smallest, weakest fell quickly, a clear warning shot to the others. Then came Zhao in 228 BCE. Now this was tougher. Zhao had that brilliant general, Li Mu, who had actually beaten Qin before. How did Qin overcome him?
Right, Li Mu was a real problem for Qin. They couldn't seem to beat him fairly on the battlefield. So they resorted to espionage and manipulation again. They sent spies into the Zhao court, bribed key officials, spread rumors that Li Mu was plotting a rebellion against his own king.
And the Zhao king fell for it.
He did. The foolish king believed the rumors, dismissed Li Mu, and then had him executed. He literally killed his best defense against Qin. After that, Zhao's fate was sealed. It was a victory won by cunning, not combat against their strongest opponent.
Next up, Wei in 225 BCE. Their capital, Dalian, had strong walls. How did Qin take it?
Ingenuity, or perhaps ruthlessness, depending on your view. The Qin general Wang Ben, who was Wang Jin's son, came up with a plan. He diverted the waters of the Yellow River and literally flooded the city into submission.
Flooded it. Wow. Shows their engineering skill, too, even in war.
And their willingness to use absolutely any means necessary.
Okay, then Shu. Conquered in 223 BCE. This was the big one, right? The largest state. I heard the first attempt didn't go so well for Qin.
No, it was a disaster, actually. It showed Qin wasn't invincible. An initial invasion force, maybe 200,000 troops under a younger general, Li Jin, was crushed by the Chu army. But this is where Ying Zheng's leadership and perhaps his pragmatism really shines. He didn't just punish failure, he learned from it. He personally went to the veteran general Wang Jin, apologized for not listening to him earlier, and basically gave him whatever he needed. Which was a massive army, 600,000 men, an enormous commitment of resources. And Wang Jin's campaign was a masterpiece of patience. He didn't rush in. He set up fortified camps, trained his troops for a whole year, let the Chu army get complacent, maybe even bored. And then when Chu finally dropped its guard and started to withdraw some troops, Wang Jin launched a sudden, massive, decisive attack. Crushed them.
Incredible. Patience paying off on a massive scale. After Chu, Gan fell pretty quickly in 222 BCE, especially after their crown prince tried to assassinate Ying Zheng.
Yeah, that assassination attempt, famously depicted in movies, just enraged Ying Zheng further. Yan didn't last long after that.
And finally Qi in 221 BCE, the last one standing. How did they fall?
Qi basically fell without a fight. They'd been bribed and diplomatically isolated by Qin for years following that befriend the distant strategy. When Qin finally turned its attention to them, the Qi king was persuaded by his pro-Qin ministers to just surrender. And just like that, unification was complete. Stepping back, what really stands out to you about this decade of conquest?
For me, it's the combination. The sheer scale and organization, yes, but also the adaptability. Learning from the Chu failure, the cunning used against Li Mu. It's not just brute force.
Exactly. It's that pragmatism, focused entirely on the result unification using whatever tool worked best, whether it was a massive army, a bribe, or diverting a river. No room for chivalry or old codes of honor here.
So, okay, the fighting stops. 221 BCE. China is unified for the first time. But now comes maybe an even bigger challenge. How do you take these 7 warring states, full of resentment, different customs, different languages, and actually turn them into a single functioning empire?
Right, this is where Ying Zheng, now calling himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin, a completely new title, almost quasi-divine. This is where he and Li Si launch another wave of reforms, but this time aimed at eradicating regional differences, enforcing unity, and basically building a new single identity for this vast territory.
Standardization seems like the key word here. What were the most crucial steps?
Guided by Li Si, definitely. The first, and arguably the most crucial, was standardizing the written language. All the different regional scripts were abolished. Qin's own script, Zhaosuan, or small seal script, was imposed across the entire empire. Think about the impact of that. Suddenly, laws, edicts, communications could be understood everywhere. It was fundamental for integration.
Makes sense. What else?
Next came economic standardization. All the different shapes and types of coins used in the old states. Gone. Replaced by a single standard bronze coin, the Banliang coin, with the square hole in the middle. And all weights and measures were standardized, too. Made trade and, crucially, tax collection much, much easier across the empire.
Even infrastructure, right. I read something about cart axles.
Yes. They standardized the width of cart axles. Sounds minor, maybe. But it meant carts could travel smoothly on the new imperial highway system they were building everywhere. It physically connected the empire, made moving armies and officials much faster, and it subtly reinforced the idea that only Qin standard vehicles belonged on Qin roads.
But Qin Shi Huang didn't just want to standardize materials and scripts. He wanted to standardize thought itself, didn't he? Which brings us to perhaps his most infamous act, the burning of books and burying scholars. Fin Shu Kengru.
Yeah, this wasn't just, random destruction. It was a calculated political strategy, completely in line with legalist thinking. In 213 BCE, some scholars, particularly Confucians, started criticizing the new centralized system. They were advocating for a return to the idealized feudal ways of the past Zhou dynasty.
Which was directly challenging the emperor's authority and Li Si's system.
Exactly. Li Si argued very forcefully that letting these private scholars use the past to criticize the present would undermine the authority of the law, create disunity, and threaten the new empire. He basically said, history and philosophy, unless controlled by the state, are dangerous.
And the emperor agreed.
He did. Qin Shi Huang issued an edict. All historical records from the conquered states were to be burned. Only Qin's own records were kept. All philosophical texts, especially Confucian classics from the Hundred Schools of Thought era, were also ordered destroyed. Only practical books on medicine, agriculture, divination were spared. Private study of history or philosophy was forbidden. If you wanted to study law, you had to learn it from a state official.
And the burying of scholars.
That reportedly happened a year later. Around 460 scholars were allegedly linked to some alchemists who had failed to find the elixir of immortality for the emperor. They were supposedly buried alive as punishment and a warning. It was brutal, yes, but you have to see it as a war on memory itself, an attempt to establish an ideological monopoly, to make the Qin state the only legitimate frame of reference. Law, as defined by the emperor, was the sole source of truth.
And amidst all this consolidation and standardization, there was still the need for defense, the northern frontier.
Right. After unification, the main external military threat came from the Xiongnu nomads to the north. So the emperor sent General Meng Tian with a huge army, maybe 300,000 strong, to push them back. And then Meng Tian was tasked with connecting the existing defensive walls built by the old northern states, Qin, Zhao, and Yan, into one single massive defensive line.
The precursor to the Great Wall we know today.
Exactly. Built with immense amounts of conscripted labor, millions of peasants and convicts, another massive state project.
Okay, so we have this incredibly powerful, centralized, standardized, well-defended empire forged through ruthless efficiency. Which brings us to the great paradox. How did a dynasty seemingly this powerful, designed to last 10,000 generations, collapse in just 15 years? It seems almost unbelievable.
It really does, but it's a classic case, I think, of how the very strengths that lead to greatness can also contain the seeds of destruction. Think about the cost of unification, the cost of all those projects.
The Great Wall, the highways, the palaces.
The emperor's insane tomb complex with the terracotta army, all built by millions of conscripted peasants and convicts, often under horrific conditions. Taxation was incredibly heavy. Some sources suggest taxes reached as high as 2/3 of a peasant's harvest.
2/3? How could anyone survive?
It was crushing, and the laws remained merciless. Minor mistakes, minor infringements could lead to brutal punishments, not just for the individual, but for their whole family. Remember that joint responsibility. This created this pervasive atmosphere of fear, yes, but also deep, simmering resentment across the empire.
So it sounds like the legalist system, which was so incredibly effective for mobilizing the state for war and construction, just became a massive liability once peace, or at least unification, was achieved.
Precisely. The system lacked any flexibility. There were no mechanisms for public feedback, no safety valves, no way to persuade people other than coercion and punishment. And all power was so hyper-centralized on the emperor himself. There were no strong, independent institutions that could handle a crisis or, crucially, manage a smooth succession.
And that succession crisis is exactly what happened when the emperor died, isn't it?
Exactly. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE. He was on one of his imperial tours, searching for the elixir of immortality. Ironically, he probably hastened his own death by consuming mercury pills that these alchemists gave him, thinking they were elixirs.
Oh, the irony.
And his death was kept secret initially by the chief eunuch, Zhao Gao, and the chancellor Li Si. Why? Because they feared the designated heir. That was the eldest son, Prince Fusu. He was known to be capable, respected, maybe more moderate. He was stationed up north with General Meng Tian on the frontier. Zhao Gao and Li Si worried Fusu would reduce their power if he took the throne.
So they staged a kind of palace coup while the emperor's body was still being secretly transported back to the capital?
Essentially, yes. They forged a new imperial will. This fake will ordered Prince Fusu and General Meng Tian to commit suicide.
And they obeyed?
Tragically, yes. Such was the ingrained respect for imperial command, even a suspicious one. And in their place, Zhao Gao and Li Si put the emperor's younger, weaker, and far more easily manipulated son, Hu Hai, on the throne. He became Qin Shi, the second emperor. It was a catastrophic failure of succession, driven by personal ambition.
And this illegitimate succession, combined with the existing resentment, that must have set the stage for rebellion. What was the final spark?
The breaking point came just a year later, in 209 BCE. A group of about 900 conscripted peasants were being marched to a defensive post. Their leaders were Chen Sheng and Wu Guang. They got delayed by heavy rains. Now, under Qin law, being late for mobilization duty, even due to weather, the punishment was execution.
Execution for being late because of rain.
Yes, so Chen Sheng famously rallied the others, basically saying, look, if we go, we die. If we rebel, we might die, but we might also win. Are we just going to die for nothing? The quote often attributed is, are kings and nobles born to their positions?
A powerful question to ask in that context.
Incredibly powerful. So they killed their escorting officers and declared themselves in rebellion.
And that spark just lit a fire across the empire.
It spread like wildfire. This initial uprising, remember, they were armed only with sharpened sticks initially, but it tapped into all that pent-up anger and desperation. The oppressed populace rose up. And crucially, the old nobility from the 6 conquered states saw their chance and joined in, hoping to restore their old kingdoms. Meanwhile, the Qin court, now dominated by the corrupt eunuch Zhao Gao, who eventually manipulated both Li Si and the second emperor to their deaths, was completely paralyzed by infighting and incompetence. They couldn't respond effectively.
And powerful rebel leaders emerged.
Yes, figures like Shang Yang, a nobleman from the old state of Chu, a brilliant but brutal general, and Liu Bang, initially a minor official of peasant background from the former state of Han, who proved to be a very shrewd leader. The fighting raged for a few years, but the Qin armies, despite their past reputation, couldn't contain the widespread rebellions. Finally, in 207 BCE, the last Qin ruler, Ying, a nephew of the second emperor who had briefly reigned after Zhao Gao had Qin Shi killed, surrendered to Liu Bang just outside the capital, Shenyang. And that was the end of the Qin dynasty.
Just like that. 15 years from unification to collapse. It's the ultimate irony, isn't it, that extreme centralization designed for control meant that once the center rotted from within, the whole empire just crumbled.
Exactly. The cruelty and inflexibility of the laws left no room for error, no safety valve, no mercy. It literally pushed people toward rebellion as their only option for survival. And Qin Shi Huang's greatest personal failure, arguably, was that obsession with his own immortality. It led him to neglect ensuring a stable, legitimate succession. He built an empire meant to last 10,000 generations, as he boasted, but he couldn't even secure its smooth transition to the second generation.
So pulling it all together, what does this deep dive tell us? The unification of China under Qin was this product of, well, a century of institutional preparation, that legalist system.
Favorable geography definitely played a role.
And ruthlessly shrewd execution by Ying Zheng, Li Si, Wang Jian. That whole leadership team. Yet its collapse was equally a product of that same system's inflexibility, the immense human cost it demanded, and that absolute failure of succession.
And Qin Shi Huang himself remains this figure of profound contradiction, a tyrant who inflicted unbelievable suffering and death on millions, but also a visionary who forged a unified Chinese state and civilization, setting the course for the next 2,000 years of its history. You can't easily praise him, you can't easily condemn him. His legacy is truly, deeply two-sided.
What's really fascinating, though, is that the most enduring legacy of the Qin dynasty wasn't his own short lifespan, but the blueprint it created. The next dynasty, the Han, who came to power after the chaos, while they publicly reacted against Qin's brutality.
They adopted almost all of Qin's administrative structures, the commanderies and districts, the centralized bureaucracy, the standardized script, weights, measures, currency.
They just swapped out the harsh legalist ideology, or at least tempered it with a more flexible, more humane Confucian veneer on top.
Exactly. So, in essence, Qin didn't truly fail, did it? It created the very mold, the basic architecture that would define imperial China for the next 2 millennia. The Han, built on Qin foundations, they didn't start from scratch.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe for you, the listener, to mull over. When we look at any system, ancient or modern, that's designed for ultimate efficiency, total control, absolute power, what are the inherent risks? Even when that power is wielded, initially at least, by someone with vision, like Qin Shi Huang, we've seen how this empire, built to last forever, fell apart in just 15 years. What then truly creates lasting stability and resilience in a society?
Something for you to think about.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you that shortcut to being well-informed on this really pivotal moment in history. We'll be back soon with another stack of sources to unpack for you.